Hot day. I've just actually come down from the Eco-Dharma Retreat Center where we're now having a couple camping retreats. One of the few centers that, well, because they are camping, we're able to still make those kind of retreats available to people who want to make that specific kind of effort. Anyway, uh, I'm really grateful for this opportunity, and I'd like to begin with a quotation from Paul Levy, who I believe is a Tibetan Buddhist practitioner and also an author. He writes, "The coronavirus is a living revelation that is dying to show us something about who we are and our place in the universe. What it is revealing to us is crucially important for us to know. Our very survival depends upon receiving its message." What do you think? Hyperbole? Overstated? Exaggerated? Maybe, but maybe there's a really important truth there to be appreciated. It's so striking in the case of just a few months earlier this year, we've had a series of cascading crises that have really radically changed our world and in some ways made it almost unrecognizable. And although we tend to focus on the pandemic, naturally, that's really just the beginning. The COVID pandemic has exposed incompetent, dysfunctional governments, not least our own with inadequate healthcare systems, exposing the fact, for example, that we don't really have a healthcare system, we have a healthcare industry, which is quite different in its focus, right? Quarantines and lockdowns have also paralyzed much economic activity and exposed the, I'd say, obscenely large and still growing gap between rich and poor. And I think it's the case that still what we can now see as already a pretty bad recession could yet expand or spiral into a kind of worldwide economic collapse in some ways. And then we had, of course, the killing of George Floyd in Minnesota by police, which went viral in a very different way, reminding us of institutionalized racism such as is found in some police departments. Putting all this together, it's certainly clear to say that this is an extremely difficult time for most, if not almost all of us. But what's interesting about it too is that it introduces sort of radical new hope, or at least possibilities. You know, prior to this year, in some ways, it seemed to me that our economic political system was largely frozen in the sense that the elites, the political economic elites who tend to control things were rather too comfortable and enjoying their profits rather too nicely. And because of all that, it seemed like change had become very difficult. But now it really seems like the old normal is now gone forever. And in some ways that's just as well, because the reality, of course, is that it was not that good for most people, and certainly not for the biosphere. All the problems I've mentioned, including epidemics, are not new, but deeply rooted. What is new, I think, is our increased awareness of them. Actually, though, the economic pause or shutdown has really had pretty small effects on carbon emissions or on the pace of other environmental degradation. But nonetheless, I think it is becoming clear that despite all the suffering, and I don't mean to minimize that in any way, our response to COVID-19 in one way has certainly kind of or opens up a kind of silver lining, that it helps us realize that social change can happen quite quickly when it's necessary, when it's perceived as necessary anyway. Despite some self-serving political propaganda by some American politicians, and I'll leave those to your imagination, it's very likely that the COVID-19 virus infected humans in Wuhan via an intermediary host or species, such as pangolins. But the important thing to realize and remember is that there's nothing accidental about such outbreaks. They are predictable. In fact, they've been happening for a long time, although not obviously as severely as this one has. According to Inger Andersen, executive director of the UN Environmental Program, the coronavirus pandemic and the ongoing climate crisis are both messages from nature. Humanity is placing too many pressures on the natural world with damaging consequences. Buddhists would call that a kind of classic example of karma, of our actions rebounding back upon ourselves. Although our immediate priority must be to prevent the coronavirus from spreading any more than it has, I'm still quoting Inger Andersen here. She says, our long-term response must tackle habitat and diversity loss. Never before have so many opportunities existed for pathogens to pass from wild and domestic animals to humans. Our continued erosion of wild spaces has brought us uncomfortably close to animals and plants that harbor diseases that can jump to us. Andersen also points out that 3/4 of all the emerging infectious diseases that we've had in the last few decades have been coming from exposure to wildlife. Ebola, MERS, which is Middle East Respiratory Syndrome, sudden acute respiratory syndrome, SARS, West Nile virus, Zika virus, among many others, all crossed from animals to humans. And I don't think she mentions HIV, but that's generally accepted as well. Basically, pandemics are beginning in what we're noticing are, or tend to be, the edges of forests in regions such as West Africa or the Amazon basin or Southeast Asia, where there are tropical rainforests that are home to a rich diversity of wildlife, which can viruses. I read recently that biologists estimate that mammals and birds, which are the main sources, together they harbor about 1.7 million viruses, and less than 0.1% of all of those viruses have been even described, much less researched. I've also read that bats alone can carry up to 1,500 viruses, which is due to the fact that they have a very high temperature, which can cause them to mutate very quickly, the viruses. We've been pretty lucky so far as being able to limiting the spread of these viruses that have carried over. But frankly, it was only a matter of time until something like COVID-19 that this pandemic was going to happen, given the continuous erosion of wild spaces that Andersen refers to. Nonetheless, and as Vandana Shiva points out, the basic problem that we're facing today is really much bigger than just these intrusions, problematic as they are. Let me quote her. New diseases are being created because a globalized, industrialized, inefficient food and agriculture model is invading the ecological habitat of other species and manipulating animals and plants with no respect for their integrity or their health. The health emergency that the coronavirus is waking us up to is connected to the emergence of extinction and disappearance of species, connected to the climate emergency. All these emergencies really rooted in a mechanistic, militaristic, anthropocentric worldview that humans are separate from and superior to other beings, whom we can own, manipulate, and control at will. It's also rooted in an economic model based on the illusion of limitless growth and limitless greed, which systematically violates planetary boundaries and ecosystem and species integrity. So as Vandana Shiva emphasizes, we can't allow our attention to be so preoccupied with these individual crises, such as this particular pandemic, so much so that we ignore the still growing ecological crisis. And here, I always like to emphasize that although we naturally tend to focus on the climate emergency, really this is the tip of a much larger ecological iceberg. In fact, we could say that this total iceberg, the ecological crisis by itself is, I don't know, 100, 1,000 times more dangerous to us than the pandemic. But the question is whether we will wake up to this in time. I'm reminded of one of my favorite Zen stories where the student asks the master, what's the constant activity of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas? In other words, what is it that awakened people are doing all the time? And the answer of the Zen master is very simple: responding appropriately. They are responding appropriately, moment by moment. But how do we respond appropriately to something like not only this pandemic, but all of the other causes and conditions that we can see are behind the emergence of this particular pandemic? As an example of this larger iceberg, consider just for a moment what's happening with the oceans. Of course, a lot of it has to do with carbon emissions. Interestingly, up to now, well over 90% of all the additional heat that's been generated by the extra carbon in the atmosphere, well over 90% of that has been absorbed by the oceans. Without that sink, average air temperatures around the globe would now have gone up about 35 degrees Fahrenheit. And basically, we would all be toast. The absorption of the carbon dioxide in the ocean has also been acidifying ocean water very quickly. In fact, it's more acid now than it's been in at least 800,000 years. And this is disrupting the ability of plankton and other species at the bottom of the food chain to create their shells. And most obviously, this potent combination of warming and acidifying water, ocean water, is bleaching coral reefs, which support a large proportion of other marine species. And we know that in the last 30 years, the world has lost about half of its coral reefs, and it seems like we're on target to lose the remaining ones within the next 30 years. So all of that, we can say, yes, that's very much connected with increased carbon emissions. But here's the point. There's a lot of other things going on in the oceans that we can't blame for our fossil fuel burning. And we need to keep these in mind as well. For example, since 1996, global marine catches, right, fish for the most part, they've been declining. And according to a 2016 World Economic Forum report, by the year 2050, there will be more plastic in the oceans than fish. Less than half of the million plastic bottles purchased around the world every minute are recycled, and annual consumption is expected to exceed 500 billion bottles by next year. A large percentage of which, at least 8 million tons, make their way into the oceans each year, right? And of course, this plastic doesn't degrade. It simply disintegrates into ever smaller species and gets in all parts of the ocean, including the deepest trenches, where it's often ingested by marine species. And by us. A 2017 scientific study found tiny plastic fibers in 83% of global tap water, right? The water we drink from our tap. And curiously, the country that had the greatest proportion is the United States, up to 94% of all our tap water having tiny plastic particles. And the truth is, we don't really know what they do to our bodies. There's also this worldwide problem with what's called eutrophication, where chemicals like fertilizers and detergents run off into lakes and rivers, degrading the water quality and eventually leading to massive dead zones in bays and estuaries, right? Leading to toxic algal blooms due to hypoxia, right? They can kill fish and lots of other marine species. A 2013 global assessment identified over 600 coastal zones around the world where that's a problem, including one of the largest at the mouth of the Mississippi River, which summer 2 years ago covered a record 8,776 square miles. In sum, just talking about the water, and especially the oceans, it's not only carbon emissions, but other human activity that is also radically and rapidly altering the chemistry of the world's water, with ultimate consequences that are obviously difficult to predict, but aren't likely to be beneficial for us, right? Or for marine life. Two other quick comments. Agriculture, the lifeblood of civilization as we know it, yet a third of the world's arable land has been lost just over the last 40 years. At the time when the demand for food is obviously going way up because population is increasing so much, right? According to the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the FAO, the continual plowing of fields with combined with heavy use of fertilizers has degraded soils across the world, with erosion occurring at a pace up to 100 times faster than the rate of soil formation. And actually the FAO has predicted that because of this, the world on average has only about 60 more years of growing crops given the present agricultural practices, the industrial agriculture that's now being practiced. From a Buddhist perspective, perhaps no issue is of greater concern than the fact that we're now well into what scientists are calling the Earth's sixth great extinction event, when there's this widespread decline in biodiversity as many plant and animal species disappear. The UN 10 years ago predicted 1 in 4 mammals, 1 in 8 birds, 1 in 3 amphibians, 70% of all the world's plant species are now endangered, mainly due to deforestation, agriculture, urbanization, as well as global heating, of course. A few years ago, the eminent Harvard biologist E.O. Wilson actually predicted that by the year 2100, half of all plant and animal species on Earth could be extinct or so weakened that they would go extinct soon thereafter. Anyway, I could go on and on, but let me just finish by giving you what I think is one of the best summaries of our situation by the Yale forestry professor James Gustav Speth. This is from the opening pages, the introduction to his book, The Bridge at the End of the World. Please digest this for a moment. Half the world's tropical and temperate forests are now gone. The rate of deforestation in the tropics continues at about 1 acre per second, and it has for decades. Half the planet's wetlands are gone, an estimated 90% of the large predator fish, 75% of marine fisheries now overfished or to capacity. Species are disappearing at a rate about 1,000 times faster than normal. Desertification is claiming a Nebraska-sized area of productive capacity each year globally. He concludes, all we have to do to destroy the planet's climate and biota and leave a ruined world to our children and grandchildren is to keep doing exactly what we're doing today, with no increase in population or the world economy. Just to continue to generate greenhouse gases at current rates, just continue to impoverish ecosystems and release toxic chemicals at current rates, and the world in the latter part of this century won't be fit to live in. But human activities are not holding at current levels, he writes. They're accelerating dramatically. And indeed, he published this in 2008. And despite the very temporary dip due to the Great Recession then, he's exactly right that the human activity has been exploding since then, and it's much greater than the problem that he was talking about. So, returning to the coronavirus now. The pandemic reveals the obvious, that we are one, whether we like it or not. I mean, clearly, so does the climate emergency, so does everything that I've just sort of tried to summarize about the larger ecological crisis. But apparently, that's not been dramatic enough for us to heed their lesson. maybe the pandemic is forcing us to do that. When China or the US burns fossil fuels, the carbon emissions don't restrict themselves to national borders. That's the point of realizing the world is one. When Japan releases nuclear waste into the oceans due to its Fukushima disaster, those pollutants don't remain simply within Japanese coastal waters. That's not the way the ecosystems work, right? This exposes a kind of fundamental problem with what we sometimes euphemistically call the international order, that we have a collection of almost 200 little gods, by which I mean nation states. I call them gods because each of them is responsible to nothing greater than itself, although it's hemmed in by the other neighbors around it. So challenging the kind of sectarian agendas that prevail today, where we still think in nationalistic terms and zero sum, the ecological crisis and the pandemic both together reveal that our destinies are inexorably tied together. But COVID reminds us that we're all one in another way too, that's even more basic, because our bodies are not just tied together in the sense of how the coronavirus spreads, but the pandemic reminds us the sense in which we are organically one with the earth. If that seems a little odd to you, to dispel the illusion of your human separateness, just try to stop breathing for a few minutes, or try to stop drinking water for a few days and notice what happens, right? Remembering our school time lessons about mammals taking in oxygen, releasing carbon dioxide, and plants doing just the opposite, of course. In other words, each of us, and also our species as a whole, is part of a greater holistic system that circulates through us. And yet somehow we've forgotten this in the way that we relate to the rest of the biosphere. Biologists tell us, in fact, that there are many more microbes in each of our bodies, including bacteria and viruses, than the number of our own cells. And in fact, most of them are not only beneficial, but some of them are actually essential to our health. Anyway, so much for what you might call the biological, the physical dimension. For the rest of this presentation, I'd like to focus on the psychological aspects of the pandemic, because of the way it's shaking us all up in obviously uncomfortable, but in some ways beneficial or perhaps even necessary ways. And here I want to quote a Harvard psychologist, Dr. Susan David, talking about how living through a crisis like this can be genuinely formative. This is what she says. People have gone through trauma or struggle in the way that we're experiencing now. That struggle can be simultaneously distressing, but there can also be enormous growth and power that can come out of it. When everything is business as usual, what happens is we become hooked into an autopilot mode of living. We all have our habits and routines. Often we're also very impacted by social contagion. You know, somebody else gets a promotion, we want one. Someone else drives a particular car, we want one. And so the whole idea, she says, of living up to the Joneses. And with all the things that we've got to do, we just don't have the opportunity to actually be with ourselves, to be with our difficult emotions, and to use those emotions to alert us to a need for change. That's all quoting her. Well, certainly one thing that's happened in the last few months is we have had time to actually be with ourselves and our emotions. And one of the aspects in particular that really strikes me is that, again, it can be positive, it can be negative, but the pandemic keeps forcefully reminding us of our mortality. Each of us knows, of course, that we're going to die, and also that can really happen any day. But usually we have pretty effective defenses against that realization, which is to say, our usually daily preoccupations, our habitual ways of acting and feeling and so forth. I'm really struck by the fact that just as death, I mean, if we think about it abstractly, right? Death can happen anytime, anywhere, right? The tree outside my window, a huge tree, it could fall over, crush the house and kill me, for example. I mean, death, it can happen, it can come from anywhere. In that sense, you can understand it kind of metaphorically as invisible. And in a way, just think how perfectly that applies to the coronavirus, right? Also invisible. We don't know where the death, where the illness comes from. We don't know when it might happen, and we don't know where it will emerge, how it will affect us. It threatens us from all sides, and in a way makes it almost impossible to secure ourselves comfortably or wholly against it. Interesting. What better way than to sort of break down our usual defenses against thinking about the implications of our mortality? Not to mention the implications for the mortality of our children, grandchildren, and all the other people that we love. I think that acknowledging all of this requires something else that we all need and that we often tend to resist. That is to say, grieving. And some people have compared our situation now with, for example, the 5 stages of grief that Kubler-Ross famously talked about, that people go through when they're dying. I think it's generally accepted now that the order she gave isn't always the case, and it's not it's not like you work through one stage and then you're finished with that and you go on to the next stage, that they can pop back up and forth. But it's interesting, I think that all 5 of these types of grieving that Kubler-Ross talks about seem to apply to us as well. Think about it. Denial, which I think a lot of us were involved in early, right? It's not going to affect me. Anger, you're making me stay home. You're disrupting my activities. And I think we're seeing a lot of social anger recently because a lot of people just find this situation so intolerable, they want to act out. Bargaining. All right, well, maybe if I stay home and quarantine myself for 2 weeks, then everything will be okay, right? Sadness. I don't know how this is going to end, either for me or for the people I love or for our society as a whole. And then finally, Kubler-Ross talks about acceptance. This is happening. We have to figure out how to deal with it. And from a Buddhist standpoint, I think this is especially significant because this awareness of our mortality, which Buddhism has always emphasized, it can enter into our meditation practices and deepen them. And therefore, in that sense, there's really a positive side to this awareness of mortality, which we're usually resisting, denying, repressing all the time. I mean, if we go back to the original story of the Buddha, why did he leave home on his spiritual quest? Because he was exposed to suddenly an old person, and then an ill person, and then a dead person, a corpse. And that was such a shock to him. That story probably literally isn't true, but as a metaphor for something like the Buddhist path or a comparable spiritual path, the importance of realizing our mortality to shake us out of the ruts that Susan David was talking about, the ways that we can get so stuck. So from this perspective, we can say the pandemic and all the other accompanying changes, this is part of that silver lining in the sense that it's really seems to be working to push us out of our comfort zones and disrupt our usual routines and ask us these fundamental questions about the meaning of our lives and what we really want to do with our lives given the limitations of our mortality. In Buddhism, enlightenment or awakening has sometimes been called the great death, the death of the ego, that somehow we have to experience this. We have to let go of ourselves in order to realize something deeper, that Well, as we say in Zen, die before you die, so that when it comes time to physically die, in a way you've already let go. As the existential psychologists like to say, our inability to accept our mortality, which I think frankly is usually the case for almost all of us, our inability to accept our mortality is also our inability to live fully. And that's the challenge, and that's the promise of a pandemic like this. But, and I want to shift gears a little bit, everything I've said so far psychologically is on the individual level, but we also need to consider the collective or the social dimension of the challenge that the pandemic is providing. I have a little quotation here from Paul Engler. There are times in history when sudden events, natural disasters, economic collapses, pandemics, wars, famines, change everything. They change politics, they change economics, and they change public opinion in drastic ways. Many social movement analysts call these trigger events. During a trigger event, things that were previously unimaginable quickly become reality as the social and political map is remade. The coronavirus is a historic trigger event, and it needs a movement to respond. I think he's right here. Just if we look historically, if we go back, say, to the Roman Empire, there was a pandemic, the Antonine pandemic. Actually, it occurred several times, but it started in the 2nd century AD. That definitely helped to bring about the eventual collapse of the Roman Empire. And more recently, the Great Plague, the Great Death in the 14th century in Europe. And not only in Europe, it was really in all of Eurasia, which killed, it's estimated, about 1/3 of all the people who were living then. This actually brought an end to the Middle Ages and created the conditions for something like the Renaissance to develop. If you think about that, it's quite exciting, this idea of a trigger event. But of course, it can go either way. Naomi Klein, in particular, has talked about things like disaster capitalism, the way that corporations can seize on disasters like this to make enormous profits. Milton Friedman, the famous conservative economist, said, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis comes, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around." Well, here's a small one. What about a national healthcare system, which every other developed nation in the world has, right? As I said earlier, we don't have one. We have a fragmented national healthcare industry. And the difference is really important because the point of an industry is that it's another way to make money, whereas the point of a real healthcare system would be to keep and restore health for people, right? That would be the priority rather than making a profit. But in both cases, whether we're talking on the individual level or on the social or collective level, I think it's really time to realize the larger implications of all of this. And by all of this, I mean the pandemic, right? I mean what it reveals about our government, our economic system, about racism, about the larger ecological crisis that has been accelerating, and yet somehow we haven't been able to focus and actually address it in the way that's necessary. When we put all this together, I think, how to say it, the ultimate source of the pandemic is also the ultimate source of the greater ecological crisis. That is to say, our individual and collective sense of separation from the earth. And unless we find ways to address that delusion, and part of that delusion, of course, is the idea that, hey, if we're separate, then our well-being, human well-being, is separate from the well-being of the rest of the biosphere. Unless we find ways to address and challenge that delusion, let's be frank, we cannot expect to have any future develop that we're going to be happy with. Bayo Akomolafe, Hope I pronounced his name right. I think it's a guy. He wrote, "What if the way we respond to the crisis is part of the crisis?" Individually and collectively, we're faced with this trigger event, which can go a number of different ways. Which way will we go? And I'd like to finally conclude with a quotation from David Corton. "This is humanity's wake-up call," he says. "As we awaken to the truth of the profound failure of our existing institutions, we also awaken to the truth of our possibilities and interconnections with one another and with the earth. With that awakening comes a recognition that we must live more lightly on the earth, to war no more, and to dedicate ourselves to the well-being of all in an interdependent world." Tragic though the pandemic is, the silver lining that I keep alluding to is that it's not only a trigger event, but it has the possibility of opening us up to the realization of the situation that we're really in and the need to address that positively. With something like the pandemic, I think we have to say, we have been warned. Thank you very much for listening to this. And
Thank you
looking at
very
the
much.
clock. Go ahead.
Sorry, David.
No. I'm just realizing we have a little more time. I wasn't sure about the timing, so maybe more is.
You want to keep talking? You can. We only have one question, and it's a very simple one.
Okay, well, let's address that.
Okay. So somebody in the audience was wondering about, it was earlier on in your talk, the author and the text that you were referring to.
I started with a quotation from Paul Levy, and that was something I read online. He is an author. He's a spiritual teacher. As I said, he has a Tibetan Buddhist connection. So that's one, and one could find that online. As I was going through I was doing a number of things, most of which are available online. For example, I was quoting the director of the UN Environmental Program, who was talking and making the point, that this pandemic, like a number of others, epidemics, has been caused by our encroachment on areas that normally were left to themselves. And then finally, I did quote a couple paragraphs from the James Gustav Speth, the author. I guess I can find that in my text, if that helps. His book is called "The Bridge at the End of the World." And the quote that I was offering was from his introduction. Yeah.
Okay.